Good afternoon. Thank you all so much for joining us for the Heart Gallery of Texas monthly webinar, Helping Children Who Have Experienced Trauma Through Transitions. We are very excited to have Samantha MacCallon join us today for this webinar. Samantha is currently the Neurosequential Model Coordinator at the Texas Institute for Child and Family Wellbeing. She has multiple years of working with children and families involved with the child welfare system. So as she goes through her presentation, if you have any questions, anything comes up, please feel free to write them in the chat. And at the end, we'll have about 10 minutes of Q&A, and that's when she'll go through your questions. But please go ahead and please feel free to use the chat as we're moving through. And again, thank you so much, Samantha, for being here today. Go ahead. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone, for being here today with us. So just a little bit about me. I am a licensed professional counselor supervisor, so I have a lot of years working in the clinical setting within the child welfare system. I've also been a CPS caseworker, a parent coach, an individual therapist, and more recently, a foster parent as well. And then I do trainings on the neurosequential model based off of Dr. Bruce Perry's work. So I'm glad to be here today. Thank you for having me. It looks like we have a lot of Heart Gallery case managers, post-adoption permanency workers, CASA workers, so a wide range of people here today. So thank you for joining us today. We're going to go ahead and get started. So today I shortened the title a little bit because it was a little bit of a mouthful, but we're going to work today's focus on helping children who've experienced trauma through transitions. So that's the focus for today. Let's see here. There we go. So just a couple of reminders here. Because a lot of this training does pull from the neurosequential model, again, Dr. Bruce Perry's work, we have permission to use his slides, but I don't have permission to distribute them. So I would kindly ask that no screenshots of his slides are taken. However, at the end, if you want to know how to access some of his resources, I'll provide a slide on how you might be able to access that information. So there's that quick reminder for us. So our objectives for today, one is just learning the impacts of transitions on children in general, but specifically on children who've experienced trauma. We're going to learn about the sequence of engagement, how to engage with youth and other individuals. I think this is a really powerful tool to take forward in the work that you do. And then finally, just some strategies on helping youth and young children through transitions and how to build resiliency in them as well. So those are our learning objectives for today. I think we'll be able to address all of these throughout the training. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. Cassandra's going to monitor it and I'll address them at the end. So first, let's just start with why it's important to help children develop the skill to go through transitions smoothly. And let's just start with what a transition is, right? It's a change. It's a change from one state or activity or place to another. And inherently, change is stressful. Now, it might be small stress or big stress, depending on the change that's happening, but that change is going to create some stress within us. Not all stress is bad. In fact, we need stress in order to learn and grow and develop new skills. So it is important in a positive way. But I just want to make that connection. Change, which is what a transition is, does equal some amount of stress. And the reason why managing transitions are important is because they're crucial to healthy development and well-being. And it helps build predictability, which promotes feelings of comfort and safety, which is particularly important for children who've experienced trauma, who have probably experienced a lot of chaos. And so predictability is new to them, which then means that those feelings of comfort and safety might be a little bit lower for them. And so we really need to build that back up for them. So this is why, transitions are important. And also we experience transitions all day, every day, right? So if every time they're experiencing a transition, they're having a disruption or dysregulation, it's going to make their day really hard. And so this is a skill that needs to be developed within them in order to start functioning better throughout their day and helping in building relationships, because when they're having outburst or dysregulation multiple times throughout the day, it makes it hard for them, one, to learn what they need to connect to others if they're constantly dysregulated. So we're going to spend some time, this is why it's important, but we're going to spend some time focusing on this today. So before we get into more specifics about transition, I do think it's important to know a little bit about the brain. Now, none of us are here, I don't think, are neuroscientists based off of what I read. I'm certainly not one either. But I do think it is helpful to know a little bit about the brain to help explain why transitions are hard for us, especially for children and adults who've experienced trauma, particularly complex trauma. So we're going to learn a little bit about the brain here. On the left, you'll see kind of a typical image of what the brain looks like and the different parts of the brain. The brain is very complex. We know more about the brain than we knew 20 years ago, and yet there's lots that we don't know about the brain. So it's a very complex organ that we're still learning about. On the right is a heuristic of the brain Dr. Bruce Perry has developed in his model it's an upside down triangle, and he uses it to simplify our understanding of the brain. So at the bottom, you'll see the brainstem, and then the diencephalon, limbic system, and the cortex at the top of that upside down triangle. Again, it's a simplified image version of the brain. It's a heuristic, it's a model. George Box has a wonderful quote that all models are wrong, but some are useful. So when we simplify the brain or any model, right, we're going to lose some of the specifics. And so it might not completely cover all aspects of the brain, but it's still useful, I think, in thinking about the brain in this kind of 4 different areas. They're all interconnected, even though they're shown visibly as separate. So just a bit about the brain here. In the brainstem is the only part of the brain that is functional when a baby is born. The rest develops over time, with full brain development occurring in kind of the mid-20s. The brainstem makes sense that it's the only kind of functioning part because it is responsible for our heart rate, our breathing, our blood pressure, and temperature regulation. So that makes sense. We need to be able to do those things when we're born in order to survive outside the womb. The diencephalon, primary functions really are around sleep, appetite, arousal. Limbic system is where really attachment, emotional reactivity, sexual behavior is housed. And then the cortex, the prefrontal cortex, is our thinking part of the brain. It is responsible for abstract thought, reward, impulse control, our sense of time, our values and beliefs are housed in the cortex. So again, a very simplified version of the brain, but I think it will be helpful in us understanding, again, around grounding it in transitions. We need to know a little bit about the brain here. So we'll reference this upside down triangle several times. You'll see this image a lot in the slides that we're going to look at today. But that's a little bit about the brain here. And the way the brain develops, it develops from the bottom up. And we process information from the bottom up, specifically information from the outside world. So when things are happening around us, the information first filters into us through our senses, which are housed in the brainstem. And then our brainstem compares what we're currently experiencing to past experiences. If it's safe or something that's known to us, we move up to the other parts of the brain. So information has to work itself up from the bottom of the brain to the top of the brain, from the brainstem up to the cortex. But the way that it's organized, we are geared to act before we feel and feel before we think. And again, putting that in the context of understanding behaviors of what we're seeing, I think is really helpful here. An example of this, right, might be when you're young and you touch a hot stove, your hand brushes against it. You don't sit there with your hand sitting on a hot stove thinking like, oh, this is really scary. I'm sensing pain. This is scary to me. I wonder what could be happening. And then try to problem solve. Oh, I should probably move my hand away. That would happen really quickly, but our brain doesn't do that. our brain is geared towards survival, right? And so when we touch a hot stove, before we think about anything, before we experience any feelings out other than sensations possibly of pain, we remove our hand, right? We act because, again, it's measured or compared to past experiences. This does not feel safe, and we reflexively remove our hand before we feel, before we think, right? So you may be able to think of other examples where this happens to you. I was mowing the lawn a couple of weeks ago and I got stung by a wasp, and I immediately went to cover my ear, which also really hurts to get stung by a wasp in the ear. I immediately covered my ear and moved away, right? I didn't think about my emotions. I didn't think about problem solving. I just reflexively responded to that, right? Reflexes, I moved out of the way. This is the way our brain is geared again. Now, if we experience a situation that's common to us, we're able to move up the brain and hopefully making our way to the cortex system. So again, just the way we process information, we are geared to act, then feel, and then think. It takes time to get to the problem-solving portion of our brain. So that's a little bit about the brain and how it processes information, which I think is important. And here, I'm going to talk a little bit about the arousal continuum here, because I do think that it is important. So on the bottom, the dominant brain areas, that bottom row there, you'll see the brain areas, right? Brainstem, diencephalon, limbic, cortex. I wish they would have done an upside down triangle of this, missed opportunity there, I think, but you'll see the brain parts there. This time moving from right to left, moving kind of up the brain there. At the top, that's where the arousal continuum is. The arousal continuum starts at calm, moves to alert, alarm, fear, and terror. As we experience stress, we move up this arousal continuum. Now, if we had warm, nurturing, predictable, consistent caregiving as a young child, our baseline is calm. So, most people, their baseline is calm. And then we might experience a little stress. So maybe in the morning we wake up, we're laying in bed, and then we have to transition from bed to the bathroom to get ready for our day. So that's a transition there that we have to make. We go from calm, we might stay in calm or move up to alert. We start thinking about, what do I need to do today? So a little bit of stress, totally manageable stress for us, that we move from calm to alert. In order to get our day going, we might have to think about what we need to do later today. If you have kids, getting the kids ready before you leave for work, and thinking about the meeting that you have later, right? So you're still in your cortex, because when we're calm and alert, still we're in our cortex system. We're functioning primarily out of our cortex. So a little bit of stress, but we're still in the thinking, abstract, reward, beliefs, values part of our brain. But as we experience stress, move up this arousal continuum. Most of us will spend our days in the, fluctuating between alarm and alert. Occasionally, we might get up to alarm. So an example of that might look like, as you're driving to work in the morning, or actually, let's think about on the way home from work, okay? So you're driving, it's the same route every day, you know it really well. And so you have some time to kind of think about other things as you're driving. There's a little bit of dissociation with that, right? It's like sometimes we wind up at home, we're like, how did I get here? It's because you've done it so many times, your brain can kind of function, can do this, and think about other things at the same time. So you are thinking about what you want to do for dinner tonight, and thinking, okay, this weekend we have a soccer game, and I also want to make sure and cut the grass. And also thinking, we have a vacation in a couple of months, I need to start putting together a pack list, right? So you're thinking about all these things while you're driving. You're in the calm, alert, you're still driving, kind of paying attention, but also thinking about all these other things. You're doing future planning, abstract thought, right? But then suddenly the car in front of you slams on their brakes. Okay, what do you do at that moment? Right? You probably grip the steering wheel really hard, you slam on the brakes, your heart rate spikes up, right? You are no longer thinking about dinner, the weekend or your trip in a couple of months, right? You're in the here and now. So you slid from kind of alert up to alarm, maybe fear, depending on how close you were to hitting the other car or somebody hitting you, right? So you're no longer in the cortex portion of your brain. You might be in the limbic system or the diencephalon system, right? The area of the brain that's much more focused on less abstract cognitive functioning, right? So most of us, again, spend time at calm and alert, but we might jump up to alarm, or maybe fear, depending on what's going on in the day. But generally, calm and alert is where we spend a lot of our time. But as we move up the arousal continuum and experience stress, we lose access to the higher parts of our brain. So there's this kind of saying that goes around of like the more stress that we experience, the dumber we get. And that sounds a little silly, but also kind of true, because when we are stressed, we don't always make the best decisions. And that's because it's not that the information isn't there, we cannot access it because we're functioning more in the lower parts of our brain. An example that I like to use, especially around October, are scary movies. I don't know who likes horror movies. I don't particularly like watching them because I don't like to scare myself, but some people love them. But when I do watch them, I'm always confused by the decision making. I was confused, but I'm like, this doesn't make sense. If somebody's trying to get into your house, why do you run upstairs? That is dumb. There's no exit up there. How does that make sense? I always think, oh, they're so dumb. Who would ever do that? Lots of people actually will do that. And the reason is, right, that person, when they come in or somebody's trying to get into their house, isn't thinking in the calm cortex part of their brain. They're probably at fear or maybe even terror. Reflexively, they're thinking somebody's in front of me. There are stairs behind me that can get me away from them, right? They're reflexively, they're not responding or thinking clearly. They're just thinking, I need to get away. Stairs are a quick way to get away. If they were thinking rationally, they would think, I need to get my phone, I need to get out of the house and go to a neighbor's house. But we're not thinking that way when we're experiencing that much stress and fear, right? So we don't make smart decisions. Now, I want you to think about when children or adults, when they were children, are exposed to extreme, unpredictable, prolonged stress. Their arousal continuum baseline can be altered. They become sensitized to stress. So this might be a lot of the children and families that we work with. Whereas our baseline might be calm, their baseline sits at alarm. So when you think about the implications of that, right? If they're constantly at alarm, that's just their baseline. If you think about children where there's a lot of chaos, if there's been a lot of domestic violence, their baseline sits at alarm. And what that means is that they're constantly operating out of their kind of the limbic system, the limbic portion of their brain, meaning they don't really get to access their cortex all that often. It also means when they experience stress, even just a little bit, it moves them from alarm to fear. And that's where they're operating out of a lot of the time. Alarm, a little bit of stress, like a transition, a moderate transition bumps them up to fear. Even a small transition, that level of stress can bump them up to fear. Again, that's more in the diencephalon. They're not really thinking through their actions and behaviors at that point. This is where you see children, engaging in behaviors of like hitting other people or not following rules that they already know. They still know the rules, but they can't access it because that part of their brain, the reasoning, logical part, is in the cortex, and they can't access it because they're experiencing fear. So that's important to remember when we start talking about transitions, which we're going to do shortly here. And I want to just highlight that here, along with this baseline, children and adults who have altered stress response baselines. Oftentimes what you'll see, and you may notice this in the children and families that you work with, when they have when there's a positive, generally accepted positive experience, they feel that and experience it as a neutral experience. And when they experience outwardly a neutral event, they experience it negatively. And when a negative event happens, they experience that catastrophically. So again, this helps put in context when stress happens that we think is relatively small, moving from, playtime to bedtime, while we realize isn't fun for them, it's a fairly small stressor, but for them it's a negative. Moving from play and fun to bedtime is a negative experience to them. You see this with toddlers, right? We're like moving from playtime to bedtime, that they have meltdowns and tantrums because it is a big disruption for them. So when we think about children that have altered baselines, that negative experience is catastrophic, and you might see some pretty big meltdowns or behaviors that come out when they're experiencing those, what we deem as relatively minor negative transitions or experiences. So I want you to keep in mind the arousal continuum. One other aspect before we move away from the brain that I want to talk about, and I referenced earlier, stress response systems. Now, when we experience stress, we typically respond in one of three ways. The first one on the left, arousal or hyperarousal. The second one, dissociation. And then the third is a combination of these two, either hyperarousal or dissociation, some kind of combination of them. And I do want to highlight here dissociation, because I think hyperarousal, it's the fight or flight response. Hypervigilance might be yelling, fighting behavior, running away is the fight or flight response, the hyperarousal. Increased heart rate, resistant behavior, maybe argumentative might be a word. You might see children have diagnoses of conduct disorder on here, as well as hyperarousal. It's more outward, externalized behavior, even though they are experiencing it highly in the body too. But it's easy to recognize. When a kid, if they're yelling or arguing or fighting or run away, you can visibly see that. It's easier to identify hyperarousal. Dissociation is very different and can be a little bit harder to recognize. I want y'all to think about which stress response, because we all have this, we all respond in one of these three ways, which one you identify more closely to. Dissociation is where we disengage from the world around us and turn inwards. So we kind of disconnect, we may daydream a little bit more, we have people-pleasing behavior, so it comes around as compliant. If somebody asks you where you want to go to lunch, and every time you're like, I don't know, you pick. It's up to you. It's very compliant behavior. There's amount of stress in that, and there's some dissociation there around those people-pleasing behaviors. Avoidant behaviors, it comes up. And then the third one is a combination of these two, which a lot of people do experience. You may notice that in certain situations, you lean towards dissociation, and others you lean towards hyperarousal. So at work, you may lean towards dissociation, but at home, you lean towards hyperarousal. So again, I want you to think about, what is your primary stress response? Mine is for sure dissociation. I've had to do a lot of work in therapy, right, to work on that people-pleasing behavior, which makes sense as a licensed therapist. The field that I went into, there's some connections there that I, worked through, and I've done a lot of practice on working on this. But still, when I get highly stressed, dissociation and avoidance are the ways that I go. So I want you to think about, for you, what is your primary stress response here, right? To start identifying and making connections. Next, I want you to think about the children and families that you work with. Now, you may easily be able to think of a child that definitely tends towards hyperarousal, but I also want you to think about a child that tends towards dissociation. Maybe they repeat back and they're very agreeable all of the time. Those are signs of dissociation. Typically, women and girls lean towards dissociation more so than hyperarousal, whereas boys and men tend towards hyperarousal over dissociation. If a child or person experiences really early chaos, neglect, and trauma, they're going to tend towards dissociation. Okay. And the reason that happens is that when you are 2, you're not fast enough to run away. You can't really fight back. So the fight or flight does not work for you. So the only choice you really have when you're really young is to turn inwards, right? So then their primary stress response is probably dissociation if they've had early trauma and neglect. That's not to say if later in life there's more trauma they experience, but they're older and they can't fight back, they might develop some hyperarousal too. So this is where you get kind of a mixed stress response depending on the situation. So start thinking about how you might start recognizing where somebody is based off of their behaviors, right? If you're talking to someone and they seem to not be listening, that might not be something they're actively choosing to do. They may be experiencing stress and they're dissociating a little bit. I also want to preface here, right? Dissociation is not bad. There are many forms of healthy dissociation that we engage in throughout the day. Even in this training, you're going to be sitting, even if you're engaged and it's really interesting to you, you're going to be listening. And then there are going to be moments where you kind of check out, like look off the screen and think about, what am I going to do for lunch today? I don't know, for 10, 15, 20 seconds. And then you come back to the presentation. It's a way that we kind of regulate ourselves. We can only really pay attention for short periods of time. And then we need a break. And then we come back. Healthy dissociation. When we read, when we watch TV, those are forms of dissociation. When we're driving home the same route every day and we kind of zone out, we've dissociated a little bit there. That is not bad. Dissociation is not bad. What happens though is when we experience unpredictable, uncontrollable stress, we start dissociating more and more, and we lose control of when we're dissociating and how long we're dissociating. So it could be we dissociate for 15, 20, 30 minutes. If you're at work and school, that's a problem, right? And so dissociation, again, is not bad. We all do this. You'll see where, like our veterans, people in the military have to dissociate, right? If they're constantly in their body and in their feelings with what they're doing, they would be overrun by fear, right? And they wouldn't be able to function. So part of them has to be able to dissociate from those feelings in order to do the job that they're doing, right? So they've developed kind of healthy dissociation in order to do what they need to do. But when we lose control of it, we start dissociating when we don't want to, and for long periods of time, that's where it becomes potentially negative for us. It can negatively impact our functioning there. So keep this in mind to start identifying how you're going to notice when children in front of you are dysregulated. And I use dysregulated, they're out of balance, so they're experiencing some kind of stress, and it can present in hyperarousal or dissociation. And the more stress that they feel up that arousal continuum, the bigger the behaviors or more deep the dissociation will be. So let's talk a little bit about transitions here. I just want to make a quick distinction between daily transitions and bigger transitions. So daily transitions, I have them here: going to school, pick up, drop off, mealtime, bath time, bedtime. I have them as anticipated transitions. And then earlier today, when I was reviewing this presentation, I was like, for kids that come from chaotic backgrounds, these are not anticipated transitions for them. So that was my own privilege there, assuming that they're anticipated transitions. If they don't have predictability and a schedule, some of these might not be anticipated for them, which means they're going to be more stressful. Unanticipated transitions are just going to inherently create more stress within the body because we don't know that they're coming or what to expect. When we know what to expect, it helps us a little bit with our stress level. So most of those generally are anticipated, but again, knowing where the children and families that you work with, some of those might be unanticipated. Bigger transitions that we're asking kids to manage, moving grade levels, are generally anticipated. Moving schools can be anticipated or unanticipated, but removal from their home or their parents typically is unanticipated. And getting used to new caregivers is unanticipated as well. So I want you to think about as well, what are other transitions, and you can put this in the chat, what are other transitions that children that you work with deal with either on a daily basis or bigger transition? What are some of those transitions that you're dealing with every day with the children and families that you work with? Ooh. Cassandra, is there anything in the chat? I can't really see it right now.
Someone wrote parent-child visits.
That's a really good one, actually. Yeah.
Transitions from one home to the next.
Okay.
moving to live with grandparents, foster parents,
Absolutely.
transitioning from various caretakers or foster parents, cut off gaming time.
Absolutely. That's usually a negative transition for kids, right? That they're experiencing. So again, with altered stress response, a negative experience is going to be pretty catastrophic. So you might see some big behaviors or big stress response in game cutting off gaming. Yes, attending court hearings for sure. I can see it now. I guess I
Okay.
hadn't clicked the right button. Turning in phone. Yeah. All these transitions, right? When we think about it, there are transitions everywhere. Unexpected visits by professionals. Oh man, for sure, right? When a CPS caseworker drops by unannounced, that child has an association between removal potentially and that caseworker. So every time they see them, even when they start developing, even when nothing negative happens, that's still housed in their brain. And they might responding to that upcoming surgery. Absolutely. So speaking to ad litem, probably speaking to any adult is probably a transition and a stressor for them, right? Especially if it's unexpected, but even when it's not, it can be stressful. Perfect. Okay. So I want to take a minute here just to illustrate this. On the left of these two pictures here, you'll see the arousal continuum. At the bottom, you see calm, and then it moves up to alert, alarm, fear, and terror. So on the left, we're going to talk a little bit about co-regulation there, right? So you see an adult who's mostly at calm as their baseline. You see the child that is at alarm in their baseline, right? So let's say they have a transition. Maybe it is moving from, I don't know, playtime or homework to dinner time. Or let's do it gaming to dinner, right? Wouldn't be a great transition. So they go from alarm up to fear, but you have an adult that is well regulated. And this can move, this is at home, this is a CPS worker coming to visit, this is a teacher at a school for a child that has an altered stress response. So every day interactions, this is happening for them. They start at alarm, there's a transition going. It could be moving from PE to math class. Not a great transition for a kid, right? Moving from school to a court hearing. That's a huge transition. From school to a car, and then a car to the courthouse, right? So they go from alarm to fear. But this adult, and this is where transitions and being prepared for transitions, the point of today is we have a well-regulated adult. They can help guide that child. Now they increase a little bit in their stress and they move up to alert, but because they're regulated, can stay calm, maybe implement some strategies, they're able to down regulate that child to a more regulated space. Okay. Unfortunately, often what we see, not often, but we do see this, we have a dysregulated child. And if we have a CPS caseworker that is busy, that has 50 other cases, you have a CASA worker that's dealing with like home life, and then this is happening, and they're stressed about their parents' surgery or what they're doing here, they may be dysregulated. And when you have a dysregulated child and a dysregulated adult, we often see these major disruptions or behavior outbursts. So we have, again, a child that starts at alarm. As they're moving up the arousal continuum, a stressor happens, the adult also gets dysregulated. They start moving up the arousal continuum. And then you have this emotional contagion happening where you're both escalating until the child's at terror, the adult's at fear, and there's a big disruption. So I want to share a couple of examples here of what this might look like, both where it was co-regulation worked and when there was co-escalation that was occurring as well, right? So with the co-escalation, I used to be a parent coach, and I would go into people's homes to work on the parent-child relationship, and I would bring activities and toys and equipment with me. And at the end of my session with this 5-year-old little girl, we had a hula hoop that we were doing some activities with, some sensory activities, and it was time for me to go. And I always take my equipment and toys and things with me, which is a big transition for kids, that it's a new toy, they want to play with it, they don't want to give that up. Totally makes sense. It was 5 o'clock. I was thinking about traffic that I needed to get home, and I was like, crap, I'm way across town. It's going to take me an hour and a half to get home. I wasn't fully present. I should have been, right? So I was dysregulated here. And then she grabs a hula hoop and I grab the hula hoop, and she's like, no. And she pulls it. And I start escalating with her. I pull it back. And we do this like once or twice. Luckily, I was able to recognize, like, Samantha, you are in a tug of war with a 5-year-old over a hula hoop. Like, not the just shining moment of my life, right? I started to escalate with her. Now, I did recognize early enough to stop that. I'm not going to win a power struggle with the 5-year-old over a hula hoop. So what I did, I let go of the hula hoop. I pulled back a little bit. I squatted down. I repeated. It was time for me to go. I'll bring it back next week, and just gave her some time with my presence and let her spend some time kind of like thinking through and calming down. And then she handed it to me within like 20 seconds. And then I was able to leave, and it was fine. Right. But we were starting to escalate. I mean, we were pretty close to an outburst, right? I was pulling on a hula hoop, and so was she. Like, neither one of us was winning here. So we were moving towards an escalation there. Luckily, I caught it early enough. There have been times where I haven't been able to. Now, thinking about here around co-regulation. A child, again, at alarm, and I was regulated this day. I was prepared. I know this child is highly sensitized to stress. She was pulled from school. She was housed at an RTC, and so she was pulled from the school on campus to come for our therapy session. And she was pulled, I think, from like a music class. So going from music class to therapy is not fun, right? So we were walking through the building. We were in an outdoor space. And as we're walking out there, she's yelling and cursing at me and name calling. And I move to sit near a table. And she comes up to me, calling me all kinds of names and saying, "You're too close to me." And she's yelling, "Get away from me, get away from me." But I also realize that she's escalated, right? And I'm trying to stay very calm here. I don't like to be called names, especially like from a 5-year-old calling some names that I didn't know that she was aware of, right? So what I did is I simply picked up my stuff and I moved to another table about 10 feet away. And she follows me, and she's yelling, cursing at me again, telling me to get away, move, I'm too close to her. And I stay calm, and I get up again and move to another table. And she follows me again, yelling and cursing. So we do this like 3 or 4 times. And then I move again. And then finally she comes over and sits down, and she's like, "Are we reading this book or what?" And I was like, "Yeah, we can read the book." And then we were able to have a perfectly fine session the rest of the time, although that did take a good 10 minutes of like moving, but I was able to stay regulated at that point, knowing she needed to express some of this in the presence of a calmer adult that allowed her to down regulate a little bit, versus she's at an RTC, they do restraints there. It very could have easily escalated to a restraint situation, but I was trying to avoid that. So you can see here a regulated adult can regulate a dysregulated child. A dysregulated adult will never regulate a dysregulated child. It's really important for us to be regulated in our work that we're doing with children and families. I'm going to introduce here the sequence of engagement. Again, you'll see the upside down triangle. This sequence, regulate, relate, and then reason, respects how the brain processes information. So when a child is dysregulated, first we need to regulate them, then we need to relate and connect to them, and then we can get to the reasoning part of their brain. So if they're showing up into your office or you're at their home, we need to do some regulation first, right? And that can be a variety of different things. Regulation, the most effective form of regulation is physical movement. So body movement is the best, right? But we may not always be able to go for a walk. Walking is wonderful, a bilateral stimulation. And if you're walking with that person that came to visit, it's relational too, right? It's wonderful. But we may not always be in a position to do that. But providing food, providing snacks, physical movement. If your child isn't sensitive to sights and smells, having comforting smells, calming colors can be really regulating. Also, knowing a schedule and knowing what's happening is regulating too. So you can, if you're coming to their home or if they're going to a photo shoot for the Heart Gallery, today we're going to start with, if you need to go to the bathroom, if you need a snack, they're over here. Then we're going to introduce you to the photographer. They'll talk to you about the camera. Then we're going to spend 10 minutes doing the photos. And then afterwards, we'll review those together, and then we'll end up, wrap up at the end. Letting them know what's going to happen can be regulating for them, right? And then we relate to them. Let's again use the example of going for a Heart Gallery photo session, right? So you told them what's going to happen. relating, it can be very simple. We think it needs to be 30 minutes, an hour, multiple visits. It doesn't have to be. It can be very short. It can be something like, I'm excited that you're here today. I'm really glad that you're here. I'm looking forward to spending time with you. To let them know that you're connected, that you're invested. That can be relating to them. And then it can be, do you have any questions for me about what's going to happen today? So you've gone over the schedule, you've built in some regulation. I'm excited that you're here. I'm looking forward to getting to know you a little bit. You related to them, and then you can get to the reasoning part. Hopefully they're regulated. They can then think, okay, what questions might I have? I'm feeling fairly calm. I feel connected, and then get to the reasoning part. If they walk into the door and we're immediately like, hey, do you have any questions before we get started? They may say no because they're not sure what's happening. They're feeling dysregulated. If they're leaning towards dissociation, they're going to be compliant and just say no, right? So respecting the sequence of engagement, this is really helpful in lots of different aspects, whether you've experienced trauma or not. When we're feeling distressed, we are not at our top ability to reason or abstract thought or planning. So we need to regulate, relate if we're engaging with other people. If you think about this in regards to work, in meetings that you're having, do you regulate people? Hey, here's the agenda for today. Let's do an icebreaker. That's some relating here. And then let's get into the content of what we're doing. That's the reasoning aspect, right? Regulate, relate, reason. I think in general, if you take anything away from this presentation, I hope that it's this, the sequence of engagement. If somebody seems distressed or stressed to you, regulate, relate, reason. I think would be really helpful for all of us to engage in this. I do this for myself throughout the day. I do this with other people. I implement it in my work life, in my home life. Really, really important concept here. Regulate, relate, and then reason. So let's talk about a few strategies for younger children. I've separated this from younger children to older children, but you can use both depending on the child's developmental age, right? So generally speaking, being warm and consistent and having routines is really important for young children, older children, children that have experienced trauma. Routines are really important. It provides predictability, which then provide predictability and boundaries, right? That then promotes feelings of safety. This is why it's really important. It is important to have some flexibility in the routines and not rigidity, but routines are important. They're going to be stressful for kids who grew up in chaotic environments because they're not used to them, but they do need them. So you might be a little bit more flexible at the beginning to really get them used to routines and get them on a schedule. And then you can build flexibility kind of as needed throughout, particularly, like I said, for young children, but for older children too. This next one is for both younger children, older children, adults. This one is helpful for everyone. Make sure that they know and understand what is coming next. This is not always possible, if an a removal may not be planned. Generally, they are doing that more, moving from one foster home to another. Sometimes people are like, oh, I don't want to tell them because I don't want them to worry about it. And they don't tell them until the day that it's happening. We are not setting them up for success in building resiliency around transitions if we are not preparing them for those transitions. So making sure they know and understand this can be conversations, and it might be multiple conversations. Transitional objects or activities are really helpful if they have a stuffed animal, a blanket, a book, a photo. I used to use this when I had a sibling set that I fostered, a 2-year-old. When they would go visit their mom at a CPS office, he always struggled with the transition from his visit with his mom back to us. Makes sense. Those are hard transitions. Those are big transitions. And we lived about 45 minutes away from the CPS office. So we had 45 minutes in the car for a 2-year-old, also dysregulating, right? So we then had this idea around creating a transitional toy, and he only got to play, made it special. It was like a little drill set that he loved, but he only got to play with it when he was coming home from a visit from a CPS office back to our home. So we created this transitional toy with him to kind of help ease that transition of, okay, now that's over. We're gonna go home. You get to play with your special toy on the way home. And that transitional toy kind of helped. Is it 100% effective? No, there were days where it was still really hard, right? But it helped a little bit, and we got to kind of stack those wins where we can get them. Verbal cues, visual cues can be really helpful. Picture schedules. I've done this with older children too. Maybe not picture schedules, but schedules that we typed out to help them follow. We had a teen mom, and she had a baby that was like 18 months. And so we typed out a schedule and put it in her bathroom and her room to kind of help her know what the schedule was. Verbal cues are really important. Hey, we have 5 minutes left, 2 minutes left, 1 minute left. Depending on the child, if they struggle with transitions, you would give more warnings. If you don't struggle that much, you can do a 5 minute or a 1 minute. And the reason why verbal cues are important, especially when children are playing, is that oftentimes they plan in their head what they want to do. And if they run out of time and they had no warning, then they can't finish. They might be more upset about that transition. But if you tell them, hey, you have 10 minutes left, they're like, oh, okay, I need to move on to this next thing because I really wanted to play with that truck over there and I'm running out of time, so that they can try to prioritize playing with the truck. So those verbal cues can be really, really helpful. Music and songs. I think a lot of us, if you have kids, know the cleanup song, and it becomes so habitual that as soon as they hear it, they know what to do, right? For older children, it can be that when mom or foster mom comes home, you play a certain song and they associate that song with them, right? Of like, oh, there's this transition, mom's coming home. So music can be really wonderful in between to help with transitions. I know this is hard because we're all very busy and we have lots going on, but slowing down and allowing more time between activities will help that child get through that activity more quickly, or that transition. And in the long run will save us money. Save us time. If we spend 2 extra minutes doing some regulation before the next transition to the next activity, we might be able to prevent an outburst or tantrum or behaviors that would last 15 to 30 minutes. So where we can, slowing down, allowing more time for transition between activities or situations or places. So the next one, regulation is really important, and connection, right? So it might be that in between one activity to another, you play a song, you do let's do a walk around the living room, let's give each other a hug. Hugs are connection. I would use this a lot when one of my foster kiddos, he would be dysregulated out in public. I would grab his hands, rub his little palms, and I would ask him, hey, do you need a hug? And so I was regulating him with touch, sensory input, and I offered connection. Do you need a hug? He didn't always say yes, but he said yes more often than not. And I would give him a hug, and then I'd be like, okay, do you need a snack? Do you want to do this next? And then when we get to, he's 2, right? So his reasoning, not fully there yet, but he was more regulated, and then we could move to the next activity, right? Modeling through dolls and puppets for big transitions can be really helpful. I've had lots of parents do this before. You have different dolls representing the different roles, and then you kind of show them, this is what's going to happen and this is what it's going to look like. And you can model it with puppets and dolls. Younger kids really, really enjoy that. And then obviously, where we can, minimize big transitions, right? We want to minimize those as much as possible. Keeping stable placements, keeping stable caregivers. Again, we can't always control that, but where we can, we try to minimize those. So with older children, you'll see several of these are similar. And when children, even if they're chronologically older, they may be developmentally younger. So those other strategies may work for older children too. Consistency and follow through are really important. And again, making sure they know and understand what's coming, which may require multiple conversations. If you're present at their home and they're experiencing stress and they lean towards dissociation, you may have told them, but they didn't hear you because they were stressed and dissociated. So this might happen if you're a case manager with Heart Gallery. Hey, did your caseworker tell you why you're here today? Nope. No, they didn't. Maybe they didn't. It's possible, right? Maybe they did, and that child was stressed and they dissociated and they just didn't hear. Even the caseworker had the conversation, but they didn't hear them because they were dissociated and stressed. And so that's why multiple conversations can be helpful around big transitions. It helps them prepare for the activity. Validate feelings and provide choice where we can. I know in the child welfare system, choice is not always possible, but trying to give choice in areas that we can. Pay attention to timing when you're providing information, which ties into the next one. Try to give information or big transitions, trying to talk to the child in person or over a video call. I had a kiddo that was a teenager. She was in the middle of math class and she got a text message from her caseworker saying, hey, you've been talking to your mom on your phone. That's not allowed anymore. You can't talk to your mom. Obviously very upsetting for that teenager. And then she's like, she came home and she's like, do you know what happened? I was crying all day at school. She didn't do well on her math test, which was already a struggle. And then she was upset and crying all day at school. So we don't always have time to do it when it's best for the child, and we are busy. But when we can take a pause and think about it, it is helpful to think about timing. If we can do that when the child's at home or around people that care for them and supportive, then that's when we should do it. Another thing could be showing photos, like if they have a court hearing that they're going to and they've never been to court before, if you can show them photos of the people, the judge, the attorney, photos of the courtroom, that can be demystifying for them. If they're doing Heart Gallery photo shoot, you can show them, hey, this is where it's going to go. This is what it's going to look like. Here's a camera. Do you have any questions about it? Look at it. You can demystify these things for them. I'm also a big fan of using books to help talk about life changes. This is for younger children too. Like, I love The Invisible String. It talks about attachment and connections that we have with people when we don't see them or we're not in the same place. It's a really good one. You've got Dragons, another really good one. And I use these with older children too. Is about, we all experience stress, and that we need to pay attention to it and attend to it and not ignore it or avoid it, right? So these can be really helpful. And I give them a little dragon too with this particular book. So books can be really wonderful ways of kind of helping talk through. If you're a parent and you're like, I don't know how to talk about this, there's probably a book out there that can help you work through this. So it's really helpful for children. I also think they're helpful for adults as well. So here, those are just some brief strategies around what you might be able to do to help with transitions. But here's the takeaway and the reminder. This quote by W.E.B. Du Bois: children learn more from what you are than what you teach. Our greatest tool or strategy to help children is ourselves. A well-regulated, caring adult is the most important tool. I listed strategies, try those. Certainly some will work, some won't. But again, remembering regulate, relate, reason with a warm, caring, consistent adult is our greatest tool and greatest strategy to work with the children and families that we serve. Okay, that was quick. We are towards the end. Here are where you can access, if you want to learn more about Dr. Perry's work. Here are some websites that you can look up. He has visuals of this. He has a YouTube channel that explains some of these concepts in depth. I was going to promote my book study, but it's mostly full. I do have a book study where we talk about What Happened to You, a book by Dr. Perry that goes into more about these core concepts. But I might start another one in November. I'll let you know. But I know I went over by a few minutes, but I do want to take some questions if anyone has questions. Citations here, references. If you have questions, please feel free either in the chat or you can unmute at this point now that we've finished with the presentation portion.